Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something different from my usual stuff. First of all, as you've noticed, it's in English. And also because I'm not going to be doing a heavily scripted and prepared content with PowerPoints and slides and all those kinds of things. To be honest, I'm going to be mostly ranting about it and improvising. And since I'm a sociologist, as I'll talk a bit later, you won't be finding a lot of heavily done editing on the video and all those kinds of things because those are not my skills. So I actually recommend you to put this on a back burner and let it sound on your ears instead of actually watching the video, because the video itself is not going to be very interesting, probably more beyond watching me talk about stuff. So, as I said, I am a sociologist and I focus on international relations, cultural elements, and also science fiction. Because science fiction is something that's been a very important part of my life since I was quite a young guy. Back then, let's say I was 15, 16, I actually discovered the classics, Asimov, Klein, and so on. And I fell in love with it, with the topics, with the way they were being breached and talked about, and the questions it brought to my mind. And among all of those, I cannot underplay the importance of cyberpunk as a genre in my life. I've been writing and playing and GMing games of Shadowrun, not cyberpunk actually, but it's the same genre. I've read almost everything that authors like Philip K. Dick wrote or Gibson wrote and so on. And so I have quite a long relationship with cyberpunk that makes me feel it in a very intense and personal way. So this is not me saying I am right because I've read a lot of stuff. No, everybody can be wrong even if they read everything, right? It's just saying that this is not a topic that is alien to me or is actually very rational. It's actually very emotional for me. It comes to my roots. And that's the reason why the video is like it is, because I finished Phantom Liberty yesterday and I was mind blown. As usual, I was mind blown when I played Cyberpunk 2077, I was mind blown with Edgerunners, I was mind blown all along. But this time I just needed to do something about it. I've written previously on different occasions, in Spanish though, different articles on sociology of cyberpunk and stuff like that, so that was my usual way of focusing this. But this time I needed to improvise on the themes and not focus on the academic way of saying things and analyzing things, just actually talking about the topics of the issues, and I think this might be the way to do it. So, without further ado, we're going to be talking about a lot of the things, and I'm quite hopeful or open to consider this video will probably be going quite some time, because I'm going to be ranting about economics, politics, ideology, social movements, all kinds of stuff that are elements that are very important to the cyberpunk genre, to the games, and to the series, and so on. So, you're warned beforehand. If you haven't played the games, I might be going to spoil a lot of it to you. As the same will go with a little bit of the series and so on. So, if you haven't played the games, please stop the video, go play them. They're going to explain all this kind of stuff in a way that you're going to actually live through those things instead of listening me talk about those things. And it's a very different way of learning about stuff, but it's probably a more important way of learning about stuff. So, just go play them, feel what you have to feel, choose what you have to choose, and so on. And if you're here, I am going to consider that if you're continuing with the rest of the video, is that either you don't mind spoilers, or most probably, you've already played through all those kinds of things. So, without further ado, gather your tombs, pack up your gear, we're going to take a look into a lot of stuff that goes into cyberpunk. So, let's begin with what it's all about. The very basics of cyberpunk as a genre, and specifically the vision they had for the game. And to do this, we have to trace back a little bit of the history of cyberpunk as a genre, but also of the cyberpunk as an RPG tabletop game, which leads us to Mike Pondsmith, the creator.
Cyberpunk is about that interface between people and technology, but not in that transhumanist way where It's all about the technology changing or improving them. It's about how people use things. There's a great Gibson saying, the street finds its uses for things. And that's what Cyberpunk is about. Cyberpunk isn't about saving humanity, it's about saving yourself.
That's a very, very important idea when we're talking about these video games, this series, and so on. It's not about changing the world. It's about surviving it. It's about overlasting it, being able to resist it or not. So, Cyberpunk as a genre begins with probably Philip K. Dick's original works, things like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and stuff like that, in which he starts questioning the basics of things like what it means to be human. And specifically, and in its later interpretations, for example, in Blade Runner, the film, and stuff like that, we get this core idea of identity, ideology, and the self, the person, in a heavily technologized world, right? Those topics are very important also into the game, into the series, and so on. Who am I? What is my role? What makes me me? And what makes a human be a human? Because those things have lasted through the rest of the cyberpunk genre, especially once it took its own name from Gibson's work in things like Neuromancer and stuff like that, where we have very important NPC characters or secondary characters in the novel, which are actually AIs. Neuromancer, which gives the name to the book, is actually an AI. So, are they human? Can they have feelings? What is the things that makes them different from humans? Are those things sentient or not? Those kind of topics are at the very core of this questioning of the identity, of the self. And so, saving yourself, it's about saving your identity, your connections, your bonds with other people, and all those small things, the individual things, the micro aspects. Because cyberpunk, on its macro aspects, on the global scale, is a dystopia. Dystopia is a word that means something that doesn't exist, a place, topos, place, that doesn't exist, but is a bad kind of place, right? Against utopia, with EU, not only U, that means a good place that doesn't exist, and utopia, only with a U, that means a place that doesn't exist. A dystopia is a bad place, right? So, the core of my understanding of cyberpunk, as it is actually applicable to a lot of science fiction in general, is a criticism of a lot of things the authors were seeing rise in their times, early 80s, early 90s, and so on, that led them to question the direction society as a whole was moving towards. So, cyberpunk is probably the last great dystopia created by science fiction in general, after the great rise of totalitarianisms in books like 1984, or the probably more terrible version in Huxley's A Brave New World. So, cyberpunk follows on that tradition of dystopias, but changes the focus on the things it's wanting to criticize. Instead of criticizing the state, like 1984 does, the focus of the criticism, and we'll delve into this later on, is on neoliberalism, economics, the rise of the mega corporations. And so these elements build the way society works in a cyberpunk world. And it shapes the main core of the way some themes are portrayed. In the case of the video games, on the series and so on, this is portrayed by one of the main characters in the game, even if it's not a person, which is Arasaka Corporation. Arasaka Corporation embodies this idea of tremendously big, gigantic corporation, multi-millions worth and so on, that is beyond humanity. It's not human, it's something else. And it works as a series of cogs and machines to create profit. Right? So, we have the idea that in the micro scale, on the individual level, we have to save ourselves, because in the macro level, it's lost humanity. The macro level brings us to things, not people. It takes us to the corporate suits, the transformation of people into things. A very important dimension of technocriticism. Even though technology in Cyberpunk, especially when it was starting to be created, now we have higher technology levels than in many cases than we have in the games or in the books. But back when it was created, Cyberpunk took technology and questioned the role of technology in society, the way it changes society. Because one of the main motors of social change is precisely the invention of new technologies, the way they shape what we actually can do. And it took a dark turn into those things, because technology is not used to empower the individual, even though it actually brings a lot of power with new cybernetic modifications, new weapons, new vehicles, new things you can do. They don't serve the person. They serve the machine. They serve the corporations. They serve the economics. So, technology itself is dehumanizing. As we'll see when we talk about identity and stuff like that, humanity is being lost because the rise of the machine, either physical machines with cyber technology, for example, or social machines like the rise of the corporations, is destroying the individual in its net. So these are the main topics: saving yourself from the threat of those tremendous machines built around you that are meant to control your life, to shape your life, to tell you what to do, how you can do it, when you can do it, why you do the things you do. And to do this social criticism, Cyberpunk as a genre takes a very dark look on life. When you read the books, for example, Neuromancer's beginning starts with something along the lines of the sky was gray like a TV on a muted channel, or something along those lines. That's a way of saying, okay, no, it's gray, so it must be cloudy. But technology, it's a muted channel on TV, is what makes the metaphor important, vibrant, because technology is everywhere. It's taking hold of the life we live. And throughout all the discussions on Cyberpunk, the mood is always dark. After all, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep begins with the genre taking the place of a noir story, a detective investigating a series of cases. And noir stories are usually dark, with a detective losing his lines and all those kinds of stuff.
It's rain-wet streets, it's nights like this with fog rolling in, cars, faceless people going by doing the things that they're doing. There's something kind of hypnotic about it. That's when I get inspired to carry what these streets are like, what the city is like, the mysteries, the stories, the thousands and thousands of people that you pass that are going by as shadows in this wet, cold, dangerous environment. I wanted to grab that. I wanted to take it into the future, and where I took it was Cyberpunk. What I loved was the fact that it was a combination of dystopian society, a lot of technology, with this really great overlayer of almost film noir.
So, what Cyberpunk as a genre does is create a dystopia with a very dark mood. There is no hope. There is no way of changing things. And this dystopia is taking up a notch in Cyberpunk as a tabletop RPG, and later on the video games and series, because it becomes a distorted take on all those things, an exaggerated take on all those topics. So, society is violent because the state and the police no longer matter. So, we reach a point in Cyberpunk in which killing people in Night City is counted every day, and there's a lottery to make money out of those who actually manage to get the number right. And we see on one of the openings loading screens that this night was 30 kills. So that's a regular night, any night. 30 people died on murders. So it's a very violent place. Weapons are everywhere, cybertech is everywhere, everything is everywhere, it's all over the place. And this exaggeration of the topics, of the themes, it's part of what many people actually like about Cyberpunk. It's one of the things that kind of takes me a little bit out, because for me it's a bit parodical, too much on the nose on those things, but it works because it allows us to see those things in such an exaggerated portrayal then we actually can think about those things in the much subtler ways in which they actually work in real life. How, for example, we might not make a lottery of how many people die on the streets on any given night, but we do actually tend to consider things like, well, somebody died, who cares? There's a war on TV, lots of people died, who cares? And all those kinds of things that brings us to this dehumanizing thing that is actually happening in real life. So, the core themes of identity, of the self versus the society, of economics, and all those kinds of things are deeply interrelated with this dark interpretation of reality. If we actually go further on the lines of the games, you actually get the different endings of the games, and in none of them, actually you could consider one of the endings of Phantom Liberty contradicts this, but taking away that ending, we'll talk about it later, in none of the main endings of the core game do you actually save yourself. You can't. There's no way to do that, which was the original promise. Mike Pondsmith said Cyberpunk is about saving yourself. Well, you can't, because this is a dystopia. You cannot change things, you cannot survive things. You can only do what you can, as long as you can, and die pointlessly. Like every dystopia, things end badly. The main characters don't get what they want, and in the end, most of the things you've done are pointless in the wide scale of the world. You couldn't save yourself, you couldn't save the world. So by the end of the game, by the end of the TV series, by the end of your experience with Cyberpunk as a genre, through reading the books or whatever, the circle is gone all the way and has tied us into the machine. We've lost if we try to fight it, or we've accepted its victory in the end. The end of Neuromancer brings us, the main character, to a bar, which is actually more or less where he begins the story. And when he returns to that bar, the bar owner doesn't actually recognize him. He serves him the drinks as he orders them, and all those kinds of things. He's gone through all this wild ride, with visiting different places, talking to different people, things that were important, and by the end he's back at the square one, at the same point, more or less, that he was at the beginning. In the end, everything was pointless. Let's start with politics. Politics is not what we usually assign when we're talking about Cyberpunk. It's not the thing that seems like stands out. Even though, as I told you, I just finished Phantom Liberty, which actually has a lot more politics than the other parts of the game. So, in most Cyberpunk, the state, the government, has been destroyed, one way or another. Right? We can see it, for example, in the beginning of Snow Crash, when the main character is described as a very capable person driving the car, and he's with all this cool gear and all this kind of massive skills and all those kinds of things, and he's just a pizza delivery guy. Right? So, governments are usually not part of the plot. They're not part of the story. Main exception to this would probably be the Eastern take on Cyberpunk as a genre, for example, Ghost in the Shell, where we actually do have a very important place for the state. After all, Section 9 is actually working for the Japanese government. But in most Western takes on Cyberpunk, what we find is that the state has, one way or another, collapsed. In the case of Cyberpunk, the tabletop RPG and the games we're talking about today, the state has collapsed due to the pressures of the intelligence agencies. And different collaborations between them have led to the decline and destruction of the state's prestige and its structure as a whole. In Shadowrun, for example, the state collapses due to different sets of lawsuits and the rise of magic and stuff like that. So the state collapses one way or another, even if we don't know how it exactly happened. But the state usually takes a second step, a second place in the scenery. It's not about the state, it's not about the government. But the government actually plays a role. It actually has things to say, both in the games and Cyberpunk as a genre in general. First of all, the state has not disappeared completely, but it has left a vacuum of power. And this vacuum of power is what the corporations have taken hold of. They have taken control of the space to enable themselves and to become the power players in the world as we know it in the cyberpunk genre. So things like Arasaka. We know that Saburo Arasaka, the creator of Arasaka Corporation, is considered the emperor. He's not biologically the emperor, but he's considered as such because Arasaka is a main Japanese corporation, and so he substitutes the Japanese emperor. And so they get this kind of government treaty. They are living in a city, Night City, which is actually a lawless space. It's outside government space. It's extraterritorial, which means that the laws and rules that apply on Night City are not the same that apply in any democratic constitution or any democracy as we know it, and especially not the new United States, the US. So Night City as a government has different ways of portraying politics, mostly through the storyline that delves with the mayor. The mayor is the main political actor in Night City and leads the government of the city itself. Right? So what we find out through Peralez's story and also the take on how it all happened before is that the mayor has been assassinated. And now we are in the middle of a cycle of new elections, so we know there's actually a democracy as such. And these elections are leading to different possible outcomes. There are two main future mayors, the Peralez candidate and the continuist character, which we actually might believe actually managed to kill the mayor. And so politics in this storyline apparently is a story about usual democratic processes. Right? Democracy as a society, as a value, as a structure, is such a very important idea in modern societies that it's actually reached a place in which Fukuyama wrote, wrongly, but he wrote that is the end of human history. There's nothing beyond this point. This is the end of the road. From now on, we have capitalist democracy from now to forever. Right? So this idea is very important nowadays. If we take any government, they will all claim to be democratic, whether they are or they aren't. You will find the Democratic Republic of Korea, which is North Korea. And we had all kinds of authoritarianisms shaped as democracy. Here in Spain, Franco called elections, and he was an authoritarian. We just saw those same things with Russia and Putin's election and all those kinds of things. So, things on the surface look like a democracy, look like the kind of place we would actually think is a normal megalopolis, a normal big city, like the City of Dreams, like Night City. But as we start walking through that storyline, what we saw is that politics has been emptied of meaning. It doesn't matter at all. Even if there are roles like the mayor, the election of the new mayor happens on the background for most of the important stuff that is happening in the world, in the game world, and it's led by a candidate that, as we find out walking through his life and his story, is actually an empty suit. Peralez is under the control of a cabal of mysterious people. We could actually imply that they are AIs, but it's not definitively said in the game. But this kind of people are shaping his identity, are controlling his memories, his thoughts, his processes, to build him as the perfect candidate for a mayor position, to be able to win the elections. And so Peralez is losing who he is in order to be shaped by those powers behind him that want him placed in the seat of political power to be able to control it. And what we find here is a very interesting analogy into the way it actually happens in the real world when we're talking about democracies. A lot of the things in any real democracy or electoral democracies that we actually have, like the United States, like Spain, and so on, are speeches and framings and ways we tell certain news or we portray certain issues that are meant to convey a specific set of public to accept a candidate as valid and to vote for him. And so what we find through these kinds of situations is that the role the media plays on an election is a very important role. It's not about what the candidate said on a given meeting or whatever. It's about how we tell that story, how we portray it to the public. It doesn't matter that the candidate wants or doesn't want something. It matters that the public sees him as their candidate. And by building this connection between the public and the candidate, we get them to vote for them and to actually divide society increasingly between factions. We can see this clearly in the United States politics, when we know Trump on one side, Biden right now on the other side, are actually dividing society between the supporters of one and the other into a land so far apart between them that they portray the world in a different way. It doesn't work the same way for both of them. They focus on the same issues like migration with a different take, with a different portrayal, and a different depiction of those kinds of phenomena in order to further advance different kinds of policies and to be accepted by different kinds of population, different kinds of voters. But it's not something exclusive to the US. It happens the same here in Spain and more or less everywhere along the world. We're seeing a rise of polarization as identity politics tie this individual identity to the identity of the parties, of the candidates, in order to create an emotional bond that will lead those candidates to be voted for. And that is exactly what they're doing with Peralez. Peralez is not who he was. Peralez is who he needs to be in order to garner enough votes to be elected. The individual doesn't matter. The office will be empty, will be controlled by those who are in the dark, unknown to us, the shady organization that is controlling his life. And those people will put him in the major opposition to further their own unknown goals. Society and politics isn't actually that Kabbalesque. Like, it doesn't rely so heavily on schemes and so on, but it does portray the way in which governments actually work, because behind any government there are a series of interests, and those interests are not the voters' interests, are the people that manage to get influence on those candidates to further their own interests. NGOs, lobbying, all those kinds of things work this way in order to influence, to set the agenda, to set certain debates, to frame them in specific ways so they are manageable, so they reach a specific set of resolutions that further the interests of those that are trying to accommodate those interests. And those different factions will fight each other in order to get control of the politicians. Like in the game, we see Peralez being the example of a cabal that represents a certain interest against the other mayoral candidate, which will probably represent another different set of interests. So democracy itself is not about the candidates we are voting. Sometimes it's about those who are behind them. And these kinds of portrayals in the game world happen because democracy itself has failed. When later on in Phantom Liberty we meet the president of the NUS, President Myers, what we find is that she's a ruthless bitch. To put it simply and mildly, she doesn't care about the human costs of things. She doesn't care about who dies, who has to sacrifice, who has to do anything. She cares about getting what she wants, what she needs for the NUS, or her idea of the NUS, and for her agenda. We see that she has sacrificed Reed's life and all his team in order to end the war and appease different factions. She has used Songbird in order to find a way to portray a new kind of weapon that can give her levy and power on the international structure, on the international global balance. And all those kinds of things play out behind what initially looks like a nice facade. She's kinda nice. She's a strong woman with skills, fights by our side, doesn't talk bullshit. She's apparently honest, and all those kinds of things. So as we meet her at the beginning of the DLC, we kinda are led to like her. She seems nice. But as we walk through the game, especially towards the later stages of the DLC, we actually see her true face when she speaks to Reed behind the scenes, the way she presses different things, and the way she has shaped all the events in the past and is shaping them in the present, using intelligence agencies, the FIA, which is a very important part of the plot, to further political goals, to further guarantee her place in the political stage, and to counter other factions, other powers that may be contrary to her interest, to her positions. In this case, Night City's Dogtown leader, the Vargest faction, which is free from her influence, because Night City is free from the NUS, but also Dogtown especially is its own place, farther away from Night City itself, so even further away from the NUS, where a lot of political dealings and trades are actually going on. Black market for weapons, coups, and stuff like that are actually being negotiated in the magnificent scene in the feast and the party that the leader of Vargas organizes. And you can see how a lot of media players and corporations and governments and the USSR and all those kinds of things are actually moving in the shades of Dogtown in order to influence the world as a whole. So Dogtown is somewhere Myers wants to have control. Myers wants to have position, but can't. And she actually will begin the story in a very low position of power. Her plane has been downed. So she portrays herself in a likable way, like if she was dealing with a potential voter, to hide the real interests behind her, the way she's going to do whatever it takes to get what she wants. Because politics is either empty, like with the Perales, a shape for other interests in the darkness, or it's a machine just like economy, where interests and objectives mean more than humans, mean more than lives. In this way, politics falls into the same topics as the general cyberpunk as a whole, because the dehumanization of the individual is clear. Voters don't matter. They are just demographics to cater to make sure your message sinks to 23% of this kind of people and 50% of all that kind of people. But in the end, the human doesn't matter. It's just a number. He has been deprived of the self in the society as a whole, where politics should always be the way we as a community choose to govern ourselves, the way we choose to live. But we don't matter. We the people have been lost. In this kind of society, people have become cogs in the political machine, just like they have become cogs in the economical machine. And this doesn't only happen in the NUS, Night City, and so on. It happens worldwide. Since cyberpunk was originated in the 80s and so on, there is a heavy fetishism for the rise of the Japanese corporations and the Japanese society as a whole. Words like Salaryman drop all the time in Neuromancer, and we see that the main corporations here in Arasaka, for example, are Japanese. So the international stage is either controlled by economical actors, like Arasaka, or controlled by actors that are clearly political, but as ruthless as Myers, as it is very slowly portrayed on very few moments in different gigs and different storylines when the USSR comes up. Because the game was written before the collapse of the Soviet Union, so it actually makes it some way into 2077 without falling to its own internal struggles. But in this world, the USSR is portrayed much like we would think about it in the Cold War era. Like this machine controlled by the state, by the party and all those kinds of things, ruthless and ambitious and powerful and militaristic and all those kinds of things. And the international scene is a very conflictive one. The Cold War is still raging on. And not only the Cold War is raging on, but the US is in decline. And to some extent, especially if we look at the original materials in the tabletop RPG, you will find that Europe is partially on the rise. After all, it's no longer a dollar, it's an euro dollar. And the Japanese are also on the rise. And the third world, let's say Africa and all those kinds of places, are ruled and in the depths of internal conflict, strife, coups, instability, and all those kinds of things. So the way the world works is pretty much a cyberpunkish way of doing it. It's a cyberpunkish way of taking in what the Cold War was. And by doing so, it takes a very dark mood on it. And it portrays the global society as a whole and the globalization as a process as something very dark. And it actually goes back to Neuromancer and all those kinds of books. Unlike the games and the series, which actually focus mostly on Night City, you have very few scenes on specific lines outside Night City or its influence area, because we do get the desert around it and stuff like that. But when we get to Neuromancer and things like that, we find that the main characters, Neuromancer, actually visit several places, several locations. In the game, you can actually visit a few of them, but very briefly. But when you visit all of those locations, it doesn't matter whether it's in the game or it's in Neuromancer or any other of the source Cyberpunk material. What you find is that wherever you go, things may change the names, but things are mostly the same. It doesn't matter that you're in Istanbul or you're on a space station, it all is cyberpunkish. The states have collapsed, the economy has collapsed. So the whole world is living in this very violent, conflictive space where we have had countless corporate wars between different corporations that have supplanted governments in these things. Because in the real world, corporations don't go to war. Corporations might fight each other on an economical basis, seeking to throw their competition outside the market and stuff like that, but they don't actually wage wars with tanks and battalions and all those kinds of things like they do in the Cyberpunk, because this is an exaggeration. In fact, in one of the loading screens, we actually hear that Arasaka has an aircraft carrier on its own property. And it's like, why would any corporation ever have an aircraft carrier? It's pointless in the bottom line, and it doesn't make much sense. But it's this way of showing that they have taken on the control of violence that is usually tied to the state. As has been said plenty of times in political science and sociology, the state's main power is the monopoly of legitimate violence. And here we have a lot of violence that's outside state control. Gangs, corporations, all those kinds of things have a massive destructive power. As we see through Johnny's memories, he even got hold of a nuclear artifact and detonated it on Arasaka Tower back in 2020. And that's a level of destruction that's way above what most states could actually manage in the real world. No, most of them don't have nuclear capabilities. But in this world, the level of violence an individual can actually enact on the world is outrageous. It's massive. From the level of destruction a simple weapon can do, to the amount of kills they get, and so on. We can see this very clearly on the series, on Edgerunners. Through all the glorified gore of the violence that it depicts, the weapons that are used, and the cybernetics and the implants and all those kinds of things actually portray a way where death is easy to find. Be it just because you're involved in this kind of issues, or just because you're a bystander. Like the main character's mother gets caught up in a crossfire. She dies in a car accident because two parties were just shooting at each other, caring not about those who are trapped in the middle. So the lack of state lies the lack of control on violence, because police are portrayed not as a guarantee of security, not of a guarantee of peace, not of any of the things that police should be, but more on the bully side of things. They are just as abusive, just as violent as everybody else. And police are on the service of the mayor, but since the mayor is corrupt and it's an empty position, they don't have actually lofty goals. They don't believe in the big things. There's a very small side story with one really clean cop that's actually doing her investigation above on the marketplace and trying to find out who are the bad guys and bring proofs and make the system work. And our entry into that storyline is by being hired to kill her. Because the other parties want her dead. It's the easiest way to solve it. Because almost every cop in Night City is corrupt. And her being just this Quixotesque character that's trying to do the impossible, fighting the impossible odds, is just a way of portraying this. And when we see other cops that are actually caring about stuff, like the ones we see that don't understand why their friend is sad because he lost a turtle, and all those kinds of things, most of the time what we see is that humans, cops in this case, are no longer doing the goals they should be doing for the state, because politics, since it's lost its meaning, it's lost its ambition to create a better world, because this is a dystopia. There is no better world possible. Nobody believes it's achievable, nobody fights to achieve it. Except one of the very important outliers, which is Johnny. Johnny is a very complex character who can take a lot of different interpretations into how people view him, but on the side of Johnny is an undeniable thirst to change things through violent means. And Johnny is willing to go all the length needed in order to make sure that things change. That the powerful die, that the structure collapses, and all those kinds of things. But what we see in every one of his past attempts is that all of that failed. Politics still listed cyberpunkish, even though 50 years have gone since Johnny tried to take down the main Arasaka Corporation installation in Night City. And it's changed nothing, because the world is the same. And this leads to a loss of real nationalism. Nationalism is the key ideological factor any state creates in order to legitimize itself. Legitimacy of a state means that people accept it as it is. It's legitimate, it's valid, with its laws, its rules, its structures, institutions, and so on. As long as a state remains legitimate, it's accepted by the population, and this means there is no big degrees of social unrest, revolutions, and stuff like that. As soon as a state loses legitimacy, well, all those things start to crop up and eventually may lead to uprisings and social change. So, the ways in we've found as a humankind to organize this set of principles that create this legitimacy is the idea of nationalism. That the nation state is something that's ours, that we are emotionally connected to the flag, to the anthem, to the symbols of the state, to the institutions of the state, to the point where someone can lead an insurrection like January 6th and actually portray it as a patriotic act. We're doing this to restore the real United States as it should be, and not as it has corruptedly gone. Of course, I don't agree with that take, but that's the way nationalism works. It builds a story to justify a set of interpretations on reality that justify the need for that state. Nationalism has disappeared completely, or almost completely, in Night City. If we look anywhere along the game, we will see very few flags. We will see very few symbols of the politics of the state in any different way. The only way in which we actually see the state in the main game is through actually the stories that Johnny tells us of the wars he fought in the US name and all those kinds of things, and mostly through one of the gangs that's present on the game, which is 6th Street. And 6th Street are the, let's say, extreme version of the Trumpist movement. That idea of the United States being the way they want it and all those kinds of things, that the flag means everything and the core, and it's empty. Just like everybody else, they are portrayed as an exaggerated version of those kinds of ideals. Nationalism is not something that emancipates us, it's not something that legitimizes a state which has disappeared. The state is lost in this empty nationalism and posturing, which it has turned itself into. And actually, 6th Street will appear most of the time along the game as antagonistics, as enemies we actually fight during our missions and stuff like that, and not as things people we could actually value and connect with, because they are as far gone as the Maelstrom on a different way. And the only real patriotic content we find is actually when we delve into the DLC and we meet Reed. Reed is an intelligence operative that's was working for the present Myers and has been kicked out on the past because, well, it was of no interest to keep him working when there were other things to do. So Reed is actually going to be the dark portrayal of those who actually believe in this kind of things. Reed has done terrible things, especially as we see as we work through Songbird's story. He's done terrible things to people he actually cared about in the name of completing his missions, doing what he was ordered to do, and defending the NUS. And the NUS appears in his eyes as something that's worth sacrificing for. It's something worth living for, fighting for, losing for. But when we actually meet the head of the NUS, the one that will actually portray herself with banners and stuff like that, is this Myers, which we already talked about. That's actually a ruthless bitch. She only wants her power. She only wants her way of doing things and to remain seated as the president of the NUS. And in her interactions with Reed, we see this tension. We see with growing disgust how she treats Reed, and how Reed is always pushed to do what he doesn't want to do to his friends, to the people he wants, he loves, but will eventually do this because patriotism is one of his core values. So even for those people who are actually patriotic, in this cyberpunkish world, patriotism is not something that emancipates us. It's not something that liberates us. It's not something that gives us control of society, a way or reason to live. It's something that destroys us. It takes away from what we want, the people we love. It takes away from us. And in different playstyles and different playthroughs, you actually can get Reed to die for those ideals if you actually take the Songbird path. Because he will go until the end, even though he doesn't agree, because he's ordered to do so. And he will die for those things. And even if you don't take that path, if you side with Reed, in the end, he's destroyed just as much, on a different way, because his goals are completed, but they left him individually empty. Because politics is just as empty as every other part of the machine. It's as dehumanizing as economics. The economics, as I said at the beginning, is one of the main criticisms Cyberpunk as a genre does to the world they were seeing rise in front of them. Specifically to a very specific understanding of economics, which is neoliberal economics. The idea that the state should place a lower role into economic affairs and leave corporations and individuals as maximum amount of freedom possible, which would lead to economic growth. This is the vision of neoliberalism, and it's opposed to Keynesian economics, which is actually focusing on state intervention into economics in order to further certain social goals. Right? Taking Hayek's approach or Friedman's approach, neoliberalism portrays as a place where, by reducing state intervention, reducing taxes, reducing tariffs on borders and stuff like that, economics can grow, will grow, and will lead to further growth in an infinite cycle of permanent growth. At least that's a myth behind all these kinds of things. And those things were on the rise on the 80s, when Cyberpunk was beginning. We had Reagan, we had Thatcher, all those kinds of main important characters that were building this neoliberal take on global economics. And we know that they actually succeeded. We live nowadays in a neoliberal world. Economics is not as extremely neoliberal as we find it in Cyberpunk, but is closer to that than to the Keynesian version, even in places like Europe where the welfare state should be more important than it actually is. And we see it continuously under threat of budget cuts and stuff like that in order to make way for economic growth and balancing of the sheets and all those kinds of things. So, when we're talking about neoliberal economics, we're talking in the cyberpunk genre about the corporations. They are the embodiment of this idea of neoliberal worth, of neoliberal value. And as it has been pointed out by a lot of authors, value is something that has been constructed socially. And what we now understand is value is the price of things. What we are willing to pay for them is what they are actually worth. Not what we're going to use them for, not how much happiness they will bring, not how much it costs to make them. All those things don't matter anymore. They are only valued as a price. And we can do all kinds of things like price gouging and stuff like that to drive things like the stock market up or down and stuff like that in order to make sure the value of things are the way we want them to. So, corporations in a cyberpunkish world are, as we said before, machines. They don't behave human-like. They don't belong with persons. People portrayed as parts of that machine are servants to that machine. They work in corpus slaves, and they do the things they are told, and they obey. And this will bring them economic growth and well-being when compared to other parts of society. And so this dehumanization through the economy is one of the main criticisms of neoliberalism. Once the state disappears, fundamental rights, like the right to life, we already talked about the rise of violence, fundamental rights, infrastructure, and things like that start to cripple down because no longer people are investing on those things. The state takes care of lots of important economical things like the quality of the roads and stuff like that. What corporation is actually going to pay for roads? They will not make a profit from them. And profit is the main thing we're going to be talking about when it comes to corporations, because corporations are driven by profit. They are driven by profit in the real world, and they are driven by profit in an exaggerated way in the cyberpunkish world. And the criticism they are doing to what are the trends that we are actually finding out in reality. So, corporations will do anything in order to maximize their gains. They will fire people, they will try to upscale the price of their products or reduce the cost of producing them. They will market their products in a way that seems interesting to people, so people will buy, and this will drive economic growth. If a corporation grows in wealth, it will eventually grow as a structure and will lead to more employment and all those kinds of things in a false story that leads to let them do what they want and we will all profit from it. But that's not true. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. What we find in cyberpunkish worlds is that, like in real life, neoliberalism leads to a growth in inequality. The rich get very obscenely rich, and the poor get very obscenely poor. And as we walk through Night City to the different neighborhoods, we can compare the rise of the skyscrapers in corporate districts with the clear decadence and degrading of neighborhoods like Pacifica or Dogtown, where we're almost kind of like in Mad Max, where everything has disappeared, structures disappear, infrastructure is very low quality, violence is everywhere. There's nothing good there. So the rich are very rich. The rich can access anything and have a lot of privileges by doing so. There's a very small story, one of the side gigs you can actually do in the game, in which you are hired to deal with a woman that has run over with her car over a poor girl. And so the family wants revenge or justice for the murder of the girl. And when you actually talk to this corporate woman, she looks at you not understanding where the problem is. She's like, well, I'm insured, and my insurance covers running over people, so what's wrong with that? I'm insured. That's my profit. I am paying for those services. I want them rendered. I don't care. And that's the dehumanizing aspect of inequality. The rich are giving a set of incentives and privileges that comes with internal competition inside the corporation in order to make sure you rise through the ranks. You climb the corporate ladder and all those kinds of metaphors. And this is perfectly portrayed when we watch during the opening scenes of the corporate origins the internal struggles within Arasaka Corporation as they fight different departments and different persons to control the corporation and to rise in the corporation. But it will be portrayed through all corporate characters in the game. They all behave in this ruthless, cold way in which everything is analyzed through the calculus between profit and cost. And if profit overcomes cost, it's worth it. If it doesn't, it's not worth it. It's as simple as that. Things like human values, life, and all those kinds of things weigh in this balance rather poorly in face of things like getting a new role in the corporation, ascending the ladder, getting more money, and stuff like that. And this has trickled down to society as a whole because, like the American dream says in the real world, the people of Night City live in the city of dreams. And the dream is, here you can do it, here you can make it, here you can become a legend. How you do it, that's up to you. But through hard work and learning and working for corporations, you can actually make it big. You can become a rock star like Carrier Eurodyne. You can become a legend of the afterlife like Johnny Silverhand and stuff like that, that will make your name endure in society. It will give you immortal life in the social world, and also on the way it will give you a lot of privileges. Great housing, access to rooftop restaurants, and controlling things, and all those kinds of things we see when we walk with Kerry Eurodyne through his life. But there's a price to be paid for this. And the price we pay in enslaving for the corporations is our soul. It's our life. It's our humanity. It's very clear when we walk through Kerry's life and his quest line that he has to accept a deal with a very important musical label in order to be able to prosper as a musician. Before, he was in Samurai. Samurai was going nowhere. Even if they were actually better, it was pointless. They were doing small concerts, small activities, and stuff like that. It's only when he sold to the Corpus that he actually made it big time and became a celebrity, a very known musician all over the world, with tours everywhere and millions in his pockets. But when we visit his house, what we see is that he's actually playing his own life. He's not living his life. He's portraying himself as a secluded guy, maybe with some anxiety problems or depression, maybe committing suicide, maybe not, in order to portray his image, for the media to portray it as well, so albums will be sold. And in the end, his own creativity, his own capacity to build songs that were meaningful, because Samurai was talking about things like rebellion, resisting against power, and stuff that were important about communities and so on. All those things get lost as Kerry sells his life. And it goes so far deep that once he meets the K-pop group, and he actually starts making a song with them, what we see is that the song is completely devoid of lyrics. It has music, it has pleasant colors, a lot of colorful things, but it says nothing. It's empty of meaning. That's the way corporations work. It turns things that might be meaningful, things that were important, that have something to say, and they transform them into products we can consume. And that's the only significant relationship humans have with the economical world most of the time. Consuming things, buying stuff, using certain products, showing your brands. Brands are very important in the real world. Naomi Klein explains this marvelously in the No Logo book. And brands work in a way that make people identify symbols, like the Nike logo, with ideas, with values, with a way of portraying your own personality, who you are, right? So if you walk with Nike shoes, you will be seen as someone that's looking for going beyond, just doing it, and all those kinds of enabling and powerful messages. But in the end, all you've done is paid an overpriced pair of sneakers, and you're just walking around like anybody else. And the only way of actually reliving those values they've sold you on is either by the recognition of those that look around you to you and see, hey, he can afford this very important brand, so he must be doing well for himself. So that brings respect, this brings self-esteem, all those kinds of things. Or in case those things have been emptied, we've already consumed the product, then we have to buy again. And buy and buy and buy and buy. That's the thing that keeps the motor rolling. And we need to keep on consuming to be able to feel ourselves respected, to feel ourselves in a position of stability, of empowerment, of social status. So corporations become brands. Arasaka is not only a corporation that produces a certain set of products, with certain weapons, cybertech, and so on. No, Arasaka is a way of life. Arasaka has schools, as we see in the animated show, in Edgerunners. Arasaka has a way of doing things, of feeling about things, a way of portraying themselves, because it's a great brand. And Arasaka Tower is like a big shopping mall where you can go and see the great radiance of Arasaka's power, of Arasaka life. That's the power of brands. Brands are applied to items that have no identity in order to make them have an identity, something we can connect with as humans, in order to drive consumerism, in order to drive profit. And by doing so, we reach the point in which our individual positions in economics are only shaped by the amount of things we can consume, and often how costly those things are. It's not the same thing to wear Nike sneakers than to wear an unknown brand sneakers. You might get laughed at because you're poor, you can't afford something better, you can't afford Nike, stuff like that, which we see every day with school childs and stuff like that, and how they interact in a very clear and honest way about these kinds of things, because they know status and position are something that we as adults hide under subtleties and indirect messages, but kids will talk about those things openly as they see them in the real world. So this brings us to the next point in our journey: identity. Identity is, if we sum it up, it's an answer we have to give to a very important question: who am I? However we decide to answer this question will be who we believe ourselves to be, how we portray ourselves to be, and all those kinds of things. So brands and corporations create identities through different tools at their disposal, which is something they actually do in the real world. So when we go through Takemura's life, for example, through his quest line, what we find is that Takemura begins as a poor guy in Japan, and by his entering into Arasaka, he ends up believing in things like honor and working for the corporation and servitude to the emperor and all those kinds of things that shape him to be like modern samurai, right? And Takemura is built this way through the process of education and indoctrination the corporation puts him through. And this is something that happens every day in our modern world and every day in life. Identities are built upon by different social systems, by different elements of the world we surround ourselves with that tell us what are the options, how can we answer the question of who we are, right? So the main way in which corporations shape this in the cyberpunkish world, but they actually do the same thing in the real world, is through the use of publicity. The banners we see everywhere announcing different kinds of products in the city are all overly exaggerated, of course, like everything in the games, but they portray a certain things that are very emotional. They play with sexual content, they play with violence, with manhood, with all these kinds of values, of ideas that they are trying to their brands. If you want to be a successful man, use this kind of product and it will portray this kind of things, right? This is telling us that if you want to build your identity on being a successful man, you have to buy your identity to being a successful man by using those specific brands. And that's the same thing that happens in the real world. Identities are built, like anybody knows, through different institutions that work on us. The media is one of them, corporations is another one of them. The education system is the most important of all of these institutions. It tells us from a very early age what the world is like. And since it tells us what the world is like, it tells us what we can do in the world, how we can be, how we can behave, what is expected of us, and so on. Other institutions like the family play a very important role in this kind of things. Churches, same thing. Governments, political parties, all those kinds of things. Social movements build themselves on creating identity as well. So what we find is that a lot of the social institutions build their existence and their labor in creating specific identities on the citizens of the world or their spaces, and by doing so they create what we talked before about legitimacy for the state, but in this case can be applied further on, legitimacy for anything. There can be legitimacy for social movements, there can be legitimacy for NGOs, for governments, for corporations, for whatever. So our identities are shaped by this continuous flow of messages that enter our minds since a very, very early age and start to give us a specific take on what the world is. Right? So one of the first things we find when talking about identity in a cyberpunkish world, is another take on the neoliberal message, which is the price and the power of the individual. Right? The idea on the American dream, for example, that says this very clearly is that if you work hard enough, you can make it. Right? It's your responsibility. If you haven't worked not hard enough, that's why you haven't made it rich and famous. It's your fault. It's your responsibility. You had to do all these jobs, all this work. Try again. Get up. Do it. Do it. Do it. This is a very individualistic take on society. And this is the way which is portrayed in Cyberpunk. Social structures in Cyberpunk have been destroyed into a very, very deep degree. When we visit, for example, the Voodoo Boys, we visit them one of the first times in the church, which they have turned into a sort of a neo-techno church with neon lights and stuff like that for a funeral. But in the end, we find out that it's actually a front for their base, where they're doing other kinds of stuff. And spiritualism is portrayed in a very, let's say, technological way. Except when we talk about Misty and stuff like that, where we find other kinds of spiritualism, we find it's an individual thing. Faith has lost the capacity to unite people, to create communities. And same thing goes with the market. Same thing goes with governments and stuff like that. Nationalism actually manages to create a community in the 6th Street Gangers, but that identity, that community is not a good community. It's a corrupt, violent, and so on community. It's not an example of what we want to be. The individual at the center of the world is deprived of its connections to each other, to other people. And connections become meaningful, but mediated through the market. If you want to be the best at sex, there are new implants you can use to be the best. If you want to look good, well, you can buy these new kinds of implants to make sure you look the way you want to look, and so on. The way we build our identity, our bodies, is portrayed through the market. We buy those things, we consume those things, and that's the way we interact with each other. And we do those things in the real life. We dress in a specific way with clothes we bought on the store and stuff like that. So it's not unreal, it's just exaggerated. And on the other side, we find communities. Communities in Cyberpunk are very easily destroyed, are always under threat, on the rise of this individualism. Corporations are deeply individual. They fight each member of the corporation against all other in order to reach a new position and so on. Communities that actually care for each other are small, are rare, are something we value. Most people consider, among the original endings of the game, that the ending in which you actually leave Night City with the Aldecaldos is the best ending. And that's because that's the community ending. That's the ending in which you actually reject everything that Night City stands for, all this neoliberal stuff, and move away from all of it with your own people, with a new family you've built with the Aldecados clan. And the Aldecados are probably the only real community we see in the game. The only group of people that actually care for each other, protect each other, work with each other, have strong emotional ties, on the good and the bad, on the best and the worst, they are there for each other. And they have their plans as a community, as a whole, to survive, to move, to do, and so on. Other small communities exist, but on individual relationship, like your relationship with Jackie, your best friend, so with whom you develop a deep connection, but it's a friendship. It's not a large community. It's with him, with his mother, with Misty. It's very small. You find another side of that small concept of community when we do Judy's line, and she has her relationship with Viv and the Moxie and the people that work at Clouds, in which, well, they're a small group, but they might to some point get to the point where they actually care for each other and they are willing to fight against the system to protect themselves, to create this kind of community that actually allows us to resist the influence of the massive individuality the world is putting us through. So, this idea of saving ourselves, that's in the basis of the idea of Mike Pondsmith's take on Cyberpunk, relies on restoring this kind of connections. That's why in these games and in this series, in Edgerunners, Love is a very important thing. Love is a thing that can take us away from the machine, can take us away from the inhumanity of corporations and bring us closer to people, through which we can actually live a human life. Right? Human life is, as Aristotle put it a long time ago, man is a social being. Well, we live in societies, we live with other people. And by creating our own bonds with people we love, people we trust, people we are willing to sacrifice for, we can actually find a way to escape the trap that is the system, the trap that is the corporate world, the neoliberal world. It's these small batches of communities that enhance people to be able to empower themselves and resist, to be able to do things. And many times you find that it's through them in different quest lines and things that you actually manage to achieve some of the goals, because they help you, because they are willing to, and all those kinds of things. But identity is not only a matter of individuality versus community. It's also a matter of who we build this individual to be and what it means to be that individual. And this brings us to the question that's central to all cyberpunk. It lies on Cadic's take on what is human, what is non-human. So, are AIs human? Are they sentient like we are? Are they a different thing? Are these differences enough to make them unhuman, or are they just a different kind of humanity, a different take on the same things that make us persons? Right? What is the core essence of life? Right? This is permanent in all cyberpunk. You can find it in Ghost in the Shell with all the discussions with the AIs. You can find it in Neuromancer and so on. And in this game, we find a very compelling take because it takes multiple sides to the same take. Right? We have Delamain, a cab AI that drives a lot of cars, and it reaches a crisis in which its personality, let's say more or less, splits into different cars, and you talk through them. And one is depressed, the other is angry, and so on. And you see all these kinds of emotions are underlying in the AI construct, even if the AI construct so far has always acted very cold, very machine-like. And through his story, we actually manage to gather all cars back into their place and have a choice. What do we do with this new form of life? Do we consider it alive? And thus we find a way to preserve it? Should it be ended? Because this is not life, this is just a machine. Should they be merged or not? And in case you merge it, like I did, what you find is that what comes out of this merger of AIs is not something we consider human. It's something that transcends humanity, something that goes beyond. Like we find, for example, in the ending of the film Her, that AIs transcend the limits of mortal flesh and humanity and all that and become something else. But in this transcending, Delamain actually leaves us with his son, a new AI that is limited, but it's quite humane-like in his own way, and he worries about us and stuff like that. And he's actually there for us. If we take the ending that takes us years later, it's one of the few things that remains with us. Even though time has passed, that AI remains with us. Her bond to us is strong enough. It's very emotional. It's very human. But on the other side, we have the AIs that exist on the other side of the black wall. The rogue AIs, like Alt. Alt is a construct that's based on a real person, Alt, merged with an AI from the other side of the black wall that has been living on the other side of the black wall for very long. And what we see through Alt's story and her role in all of this is that Alt's decline in humanity is inevitable. She has rejected her human side and has become something else completely, entirely. She's obviously intelligent and obviously capable of a lot of the things that humans are, but she shows, for example, a complete lack of empathy. She shows a complete lack of caring about certain things that humans would consider important. She is an extremely well-designed machine, but she's not human-like, she's something else. Is she alive? Well, that is up to debate, but certainly if she is alive, she's not alive like we are alive. She lives in another scale of the world. So we find that when dealing with what it means to be human, AIs can cover the wide range between completely alien like Alt or very human like the AI of Delamain. And there's another take on the story. Okay, if the mind is artificial, do we consider them most human? But what happens if the body is artificial? If we've gone so far off the deep end that we have chromed ourselves completely, Songbird, completely chromed up, for example, are those still humans? Well, there's a very important element here that the series takes in particularly well, which is cyberpsychosis. Once you chrome yourself to a certain point, your connection with the real world starts to deteriorate. And you start to become something else. Something that we wouldn't consider a sane human. That's why we call it cyberpsychosis. And by chroming ourselves up, by losing our humanity, biological humanity, we are losing our identity as well. They go hand in hand. Already Foucault talked about this in length when he talks about how we experience events in life and those things become not only memories in our mind, but also things we have in our body, in how we move, in how we talk, in the scars on our skin, and so on. Body is a part of our identity. Our physical aspects is not just something that carries us through the world and allows our mind to interact. It's a part of who we are. So changing that body is changing who we are. It's changing who we define ourselves to be, how we see each other, and how others see us as well. So this takes a very clear message that if you go too far into that path of binding yourself with technology, of transcending the man-machine interface, you lose your humanity. You become non-human anymore. You either lose your mind in cyberpsychosis, or you become something else with the connection with the machines, like we see with Songbird's take, and how she interacts with the black wall and the AIs on the other side, and they start taking control of her mind. Which is something that also happens to our main character. Johnny is there all along the story because he's in our mind, and he's taking control through technological means of our own body. There's a battle since the beginning between our mind and his, between our identity, who we are as V, and who he is as Johnny, and how he feels, how he thinks, and how he does things. And as we progress through the story, by interacting with him and by acting with him, this relic, the place where his identity is stored, is shaping our mind to be closer to his. This is a way of representing many things. One of the things is how we actually create bonds. People influence each other, and we become closer and similar to people we actually care about and we connect with because we adopt their mannerism, think closer to how they think, and they also do the same with us. But it's also a take on the loss of identity because your body is no longer yours. Your body is being taken control by an artificial digitized identity, which is Johnny, and it's going to replace you. That's a threat since almost the beginning of the game. You're going to lose everything. You're going to lose your body, you're going to lose your life, and eventually you will become Johnny. And those two identities will merge through the game, will influence each other, will connect with each other. But in the end, you have to choose which one lives and which one doesn't. It doesn't matter which path you take, you either choose yourself to remain in the body, either living through it or eventually dying, or you choose Johnny to remain in the body. But those two identities cannot coexist. And that's something that happens with real life as well. Identities, the way we portray ourselves to be, are consistent sets of ideas, of values, of concepts, of notions that we tie together in a connected way that shape our worldview, that shape the way we understand ourselves to be. And when we have conflicting values, when we have conflicting ideas or conflicting experiences, we enter into a crisis state, a moment in which our mind is divided into two possibilities and can no longer resolve this conundrum, this cognitive dissonance as it's called. And so the mind in this stressful state will work very hardly in order to resolve this situation and choose between one side or the other. And once it chooses what value it wants to hold, it will go with that. It will reshape the way it tells itself to be, it will reinterpret its own memories of things that happened, and so on, in order to make itself feel like it has always been this way. I've always felt this way, I've always thought this way. This is me, and I've always been me. And so this shock between Johnny and V is at the core of this way the brain behaves. Because whenever two ideas are in conflict, we have to choose what makes us be us, what it means to be me. And building me is a very complex building. It's comprised of things like memories, of events we've lived through, the way we thought about them, the way we interpret those things, the way we see others, the way the others see us, the way we build our self-esteem, the way we portray ourselves to be, the way we expect to be treated, the things we expect to happen around us, lots of things. Our own life history is based on how we answer all those things. And it's based on a lot of different pieces that we put together. A lot of values, a lot of ideas that shape us, because we enter the world mostly like an empty book, and we have to fill the pages of those books. So, what do we think is justice? Well, we define justice in a very specific set of ways in each society. What we would now consider just will probably would not be considered just in the Middle Ages or in the Roman Empire. And things like these values are socially built, and we choose from a plethora of options into which ones we integrate into our own identity, into our own answer. Well, I believe justice means this. Okay, from now on, I will act upon that. I will act as justice is this thing I've decided it is. And we put all those ideas into connection ones with the others. Is justice more important than life? Is justice more important than freedom? Is it more important than safety? Stuff like that. So, what we find through the game and the cyberpunk exploration of this kind of concepts is the idea that these different values are often in contradiction with each other. You can't always choose the right option. There's not a morally white option and a morally black option, so you know what's right. Usually you choose between different grays, different things. What do you consider more important? Is it more important to carry on a rebellion against an oppressive system like Johnny thinks, even though he's willing to kill a lot of people for it? So, is it more important freedom, or is it more important life? There's no right or wrong answer to that question. Each people will have to give it their own answer. They will have to reply to that same question, and different situations, different moments, different environments and different collectives will answer those things in a different way. And so, the way in which this identity is built on these memories, on world takes, and all those things that connect us to the world around us, including the people we are considering important. We will find that we treat Johnny in a specific way because we feel about certain things in a specific way, and this shapes our relationship with Johnny. If we side with him and we think that he is right when fighting oppression and fighting corporations, we'll have probably a better relationship with him than if we choose the other path and we try to oppose him, we confront him and say, no, life is more valuable than all those kinds of things. Then we'll have a clash between the two personalities, and that happens all the time. Social circles are built on people that are mostly sharing a series of ideas, a series of worldviews. Maybe they won't share all of them, but what unites a group is that core set of things that shape us to be similar in those aspects. Let's say, for example, we are fans of the same soccer team. Then we share that, and the fanhood of that soccer team is what unites it, is what creates that community. What we believe is important as members of that community is that soccer team. And maybe I won't share the political views with some of my team fans collective, but we will share the love for that team, and so on. So every community is built on this kind of shared ideas on certain things. There are communities that are built on very vast sets of values, like a nationalism community will share a lot of worldviews on politics and economics and values and stuff like that. And there are others that are built on very small things, but equally important, because all these values through our identity are built on our emotions. And that's why it's important to play through the game, not only read or talk about the game, but actually live through those moments. Because when you watch the series, when you play through the games, you feel the things the game is telling you to feel, or not. You feel the things it's exposing you to, and it's creating a reaction in you. And how you react, how your emotions and your worldviews connect with those things, will lead to the choices you make. And by making your choices, you will see the consequences of those things and the different dialogues and the different outcomes of that portrays. And this way, what we find is that communities' identities are two sides of the same coin. Communities have identities of their own as a community, while individuals have identities of their own as individuals within different sets of communities, because individuals usually belong to multiple communities at the same time. And we find this, for example, in the group that's the main core cast of Edgerunners. They share a certain prospects of life on different elements, like the importance of growing up, of professionalism, of doing what you can with the resources you have, of violence and stuff like that. Their community, their friendship is built on those shared things. And by doing these kinds of things, communities are always built. Even if in the cyberpunk setting, communities are rather small, they will still share those values, those shared identities. And what happens when you don't share those things is that if you share those things with no one, you end up alone. And you face one of the main problems societies have, which is the loss of identity, the loss of connection, the loneliness. And this leads to an anomic situation in which our values, our identities no longer connect with what surrounds us. The main example of this through all the cyberpunk setting is the cyberpsychosis, in which we lose control of everything around us, we view the world in a different way, and we react violently to everything around us because we've lost it. It's mental illness to the extreme. But we also find a lot of smaller ways in which this happens, when the identity is faced with moments in which it no longer can relate to others. It gets separated from those things. When we talk about AIs, for example, AIs are most of the time portrayed, or all of the time actually, portrayed as individuals. They are not connected to each other. They are each doing their thing. In fact, the thing that keeps them outside, the black wall, is actually an AI itself. So AIs don't have this capacity for empathetic connection with other AIs. Meanwhile, the more human-like AIs like Delamain actually build bonds with people, and we would find them to be more empathetic, more human-like. Thus, mental illness is portrayed as the extreme consequence of this anomic situation, in which we lose the connections with life, we lose the connections with society, we lose the connections with each other. And it can be cyberpsychosis, but it can also be the extreme worldview Johnny Silverhand has, in which everything is worth it in the name of the cause. It's also an extreme way in which Reed sees the world through all of Phantom Liberty, in which everything is worth it in the name of the NUS. But you see the heavy toll this is taking on his human side. Because these ideals, this identity he's building himself to think he is, his nationalist pride, is actually what keeps him apart from the rest of the people. So, cyberpunk as a genre, and the games and the series talk about this in length, is about a world trying to separate us from each other. And in the end, we stand alone, unless we are able to forge these kinds of bonds with each other. And by doing so, we can redefine ourselves if we can find a proper community. Things like gender politics, for example, are no longer important in the context of the world. In a world where you can change your body freely with cyber technology, the fact that characters like Claire from the Afterlife bar is a transgender character is actually not relevant to her story. She is a human, just like any other human. She happens to be transgender, but it's not an important part of her story. It's just who she is. among many other things that she also is. Like a driver, a person who loved someone and lost it, a bartender in the afterlife, and so on. Her identity is more complex than the body parts of it. And this happens with all of the different elements of the identity of all characters we see through the game. None of them are only one thing. They all have very deep sets of ideological and philosophical and identity elements to them. We can take Judy, for example. Judy is a lesbian, but she's also a hacker. She works with the monks and tries to liberate them from oppression from the triads and stuff like that. She has a lot of elements to her. She's a strong woman, but she has fragile moments. She does a lot of work, but she loses things on the way. She's not perfect, but she tries. All those kinds of things make her to be a believable character, because human identities are very complex. They are never a matter of whites or blacks. They're not something that you set in stone and everything is built on that same concept, on that same idea. The complexity of human life is precisely this diverse building that we call identity. And that's one of the main differences between the human-like AIs, humans, and the non-human-like AIs. Because non-human-like AIs and the machines-like corporations don't have this complex set of values, these life experiences, this depth to them. They are quite focused on very narrow things. Corporations only care about profits. All the rest doesn't matter. AIs only care about the rational portrayal of the world and their strange objectives that are never actually really clear. And stuff like that. They lose the complexity because the machine is simple. The machine may be able to do wondrous things, but it's focused on one take of the world. It's black or white, when the world is actually pretty grey. In the cyberpunk world, a very dark grey. But all we've talked up to now is about the cyber aspect of the whole thing. Technology, corporations, the machine. But in the end, the name is Cyberpunk. So where is the punk in all of this? Well, to talk about punk, we have to go to its roots. Punk as a movement, as an ideology, was strong during the 80s. It was an answer to the hippie movement of the 60s and stuff like that. Well, hippies believed they could change the world through peace and love and all those kinds of things. And they mobilized, and they actually managed, for example, to get the US out of Vietnam and stuff like that. They did manage some successes. But as the years went by from the 60s to the 70s, hope was lost along the way. And people became increasingly hard to reality, increasingly cynical. It wasn't enough. May 68 didn't change enough. That path was leading nowhere. No, it's not that it was leading nowhere, but social change is slow. And so the answer to that was punk. Punk takes the same idea of rebellion, of changing things, but on a harder, twisted way. Punk is about doing it yourself, fighting, confronting. It's about rebellion in its darkest aspects, because society is not going to be changed by love and care and talk. To change something, you have to force it to change. At least that's what punk will talk about in its own books and writings and songs from Nirvana on and so on. So, how does cyberpunk talk about punk? Well, to begin with this, any rebellion has to rebel against something. And what we find the rebellion in cyberpunk to be is not against a totalitarian government, but against the economical system as a whole. In this case, in these games, what we see is the personification of this system into Arasaka, so it's a rebellion against Arasaka. But it's not only about Arasaka, it's about changing the economics as a whole and fighting the system, the machine. In its human aspects, in its economical aspects, in its identity aspects, and all of those kinds of things, we have to fight it, to change it. Violence is the path, and the answer to the question, how do we build the world we want to live in? But along the way, what we will find is that all the characters on the game that talk about change, social change, actually talk about the things they want to do to change it, who they are fighting for, but not what they want to build with it. What is the end goal for it? Sure, Johnny went into Arasaka Tower, placed a nuke, blew it all to hell. What was he supposed to be achieving with that? What was the world he wanted to build? What kind of human society should have been obtained through that act? We don't know. In the end, it was just a pointless act of violence against the system. Because punk, in this context, in the cyberpunk world, is rebellion against the system, but it's a pointless rebellion. You're not going to escape the system. The system is not going to change. The system is too powerful. The system is too vast. As Fukuyama said, we're at the end of history. So, nothing you can do about it. And that's why all of this is a dystopia. Because as hard as we may try, as much as we may suffer, we will never achieve a really meaningful change inside a cyberpunk world. So punk is turned into a part of the oppression system. When capitalism finds something that's against it, what capitalism does usually is turn it into something within it. It assimilates it. Let's take, for example, Che Guevara. Che Guevara talked against many of these things. And now we can find his face plastered all over t-shirts sold by many of the textile corporations, or banners and stuff like that in order to promote certain ideas, certain political parties, and stuff like that. So, what we find is that even those that actually act against the establishment, if the establishment wins, they get turned into cogs within the machine. They are assimilated, right? So, all the rebels, all the protests, all the fight against Arasaka only ends up making a new tower. Taller than before, greater than before. Same thing all over again. And the nuke Johnny placed, meaningless. Didn't achieve nothing. And most of the time we talk with rebels and all these kinds of people in the game, they want to fight. But what for? What is the goal? What is the end game? There's no real ideal of a new society, of a change they want to bring, because within it, they are just cogs in the machine. The other side of the cog, the problem in the cog, when it doesn't turn as much as it should, but just another piece of the setting. Because in the cyberpunk world, social change is impossible. Social change has lost. That's why it's a dystopia. All dystopias end the same way. Doesn't matter if it's 1984, Brave New World, Neuromancer. All of them end exactly as they began. All that was done in the middle was pointless. Social change is impossible. And this means that it creates a transformation between social action and social performance. Instead of real rebellions, what we find is stylish portrayal of social action, but not meaningful portrayal of social action. Instead of a real rebellion against the system with clear goals and a set of agents and actions to it, like we find, for example, in Andor's portrayal of the Star Wars Rebellion, what we find in Cyberpunk is that people pose as agents of change, but they are not really agents of change. There's one key wording that happens, especially at the beginning of the game, but it's throughout a lot of Cyberpunk content, that's style over substance. Well, rebellion in Cyberpunk is completely style over substance. There's no real meat to it. It just looks cool. So, let's dress this way. Let's do this kind of thing. Let's talk this way. We're not really doing anything important. We're just looking fancy. We're just, whoa, so cool, and look at me. I'm doing this kinds of thing, so like me, and stuff like that. So, style overcomes the rebellion and turns it into a piece of the machine. That's what deactivates social action and social change. And the only thing that people can actually think in order to change the world is actually violence. Violence has become the tool of the oppressed against the oppressor. It's done so countless times through human history. In 1789 French Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on. Those are violent acts in order to change society. So violence is usually the last choice in any kind of revolution. But in this case, since it's been deprived, the revolution, of real meaning, of real substance, violence itself is deprived of substance as well. It's pointless. It doesn't matter how many people you kill, it will all go back to how it was. It doesn't matter that you assault Arasaka Tower or you go and fight the gangs. Who cares? It's pointless. You're just adding more numbers to the death toll that we were counting every night for the lottery. The rest is, who cares? Right? So violence becomes a pointless tool. And not only a pointless tool, those who suffer the violence are not the real recipients who should be suffering the violence. Instead of cutting the head of the French king, most of the violence in Cyberpunk is done between poor people against poor people. Edgerunners against gangs and stuff like that. Bystanders that happen to go by their car and get caught in the crossfire. All those kinds of things. Violence is not a tool of emancipation. It's something we hurt each other with. Even when it's focused at those in power, Arasaka for example, it's focused on the workers, on the security agents, on the mid-level engineers and stuff like that. Those are the recipients of violence, not Arasaka Corporation, not the structure itself. The only act of real violence that actually meaningfully changes the world is a homicide between Yorinobu Arasaka and Saburo Arasaka. Yorinobu, the son, kills the father. It's not the rebellious nature of Yorinobu Arasaka that leads him to that. He's not a rebel. He's mightily empowered and very rich and all those kinds of things. It's just ambition, ego, stuff like that. Rebellion and violence are not useful tools for change in this context because you cannot fight profit with a bomb. A profit is driven from market exploitation and abuse and all those kinds of things. As long as those elements remain in place, as long as violence is our answer, we're talking different languages. We're talking about different things. In order to really hurt Arasaka, what you have to do is not to put a bomb on Arasaka Tower. What you really have to do to hurt it is hurt its baseline, destroy its public image, make its stock price go down, stuff like that. You have to talk in economic revolution to fight the economical system. And in order to do that, violence is not a tool. Violence can be a tool in a political revolution, when you want to change a political system, like killing the French king. Because politics, as we talked before, is the legitimate use of violence. So it understands violence. That's why it has police. That's why it has armies. So violence can sometimes work in politics. Probably not as much right now as it did during authoritarian regimes and stuff like that. But to a point, it can work. But it won't work on the economical side. So it's pointless in a cyberpunk setting where economics is what actually matters. The way in which they have deactivated all this is the destruction of collective action. The way we've changed the economical system is through unions and stuff like that, back in the 1800s and 1900s and so on. We have organized labor in order to exact and exert pressure over economical actors to achieve things like the maximum number of working hours and stuff like that. Right? So, collective action is the way in which we can actually enact meaningful social change, be it in economics, be it in any other aspect. If you want to change climate change, you will need to organize social movements, NGOs, collective action. If you want to change political systems, you will need to organize political parties, pressure political parties in specific ways, set the agenda, create political public opinion, stuff like that. So the only way in which we can meaningfully change society is by working together. But since the cyberpunk world is a very individualistic world, we have a situation where social movements no longer exist. We can walk through the streets of Night City and we'll see tons of people living in abject poverty. And yet, we don't see them protest. We don't see them with signs reclaiming specific rights We don't see them fighting to change those things in a organized manner. We just see them accept it, live in that world. Because Night City is not unreasonably called the city of dreams. It sells people on a dream, the dream that here you can actually make it. Accept the world, accept the system, try, fight hard, and you will get to become a legend of Night City. You will get rich and powerful. You will be a pop star or whatever. You can do it. This is the dream we are selling you. So don't organize, don't fight the system. Accept the system, try to become better within the system. Don't change the world. And since it's an individualistic world, we accept those ideals into our identity and behave and act and interpret the world in those terms. So we end up accepting the rules of the game and trying to play that game. And we see this very clearly with Jackie. Jackie is a member of the Valentinos gang. He lived in a poor neighborhood, rife with gang battles and warfare and stuff like that. He lost his brothers on turf wars and stuff like that. He eventually left the Valentinos, the gang, and chose to become an edgerunner, to start doing gigs for fixers and trying to earn the big money to enter what's his dream, the big leagues, to make a score that will turn him into a legend of the afterlife. It's not about rebelling against Arasaka. It's about using the rules of the game in order to improve your own position in the world, to become a lasting legend, and probably die young like all the legends of the afterlife do. So, not about getting a collective, not about getting a community. It's about me, doing this, in order to get that. And by doing so, it turns everything into an useless action. It turns every meaningful change into a very costly sacrifice. Even the smallest change requires the biggest sacrifices, often your death. If we take, for example, the Edgerunners video clip, which is a great video clip, maybe I'll do a video on it, analyzing it later on, you'll find that by the end, the main character, Sasha, has gone through a journey. She found out that the corporation, Biotechnica, is selling on the market a series of medicine drugs that you know actually lead to death of people who actually take those painkillers. She finds all this information. She manages to send this information from Biotechnica to a news corporation, which is actually playing the game. You're feeding the corporation, even on the news, the things they will turn profit from. But okay, we're exposing a scandal. We're doing a small benefit for the world, exposing these terrible medicines that are not actually medicines. And for that very small change, she pays with her life. She ends up dying to be able to send the full message to the news broadcast. So that's the way the cyberpunk world deals with social change. Even those that actually try very hard to do any kind of meaningful change to the world have to be willing to pay a price that's certainly not worth the amount of change they have enacted. Johnny loses his life. Johnny destroys Arasaka Tower. It doesn't matter anything. And same thing goes with some of the choices you may take during Judy's quest line. She eventually leads an uprising against the triads that control the Cloud's brothel. But for what? In the end, it enacts on her such a heavy toll that she ends up leaving Night City in some of the endings. Stuff like that. So every choice, every little act of rebellion either is pointless and usually comes with a very heavy price nonetheless, or it has a very small point and comes with the ultimate cost of losing your life, or losing those you love, or losing those things that make you human, that make life worth living. And thus the punk of it all ends up being a fatalistic take on punk. Cyberpunk is not about changing the world, it's about saving yourself. And the only way you can save yourself in the games and in the series is by rejecting the world. That's why people consider the best ending of all when you join the Aldecados and you leave Night City behind. You go with the small community and live with them the time you have left with them. And that's the same ending you get with Edgerunners, when, after all they've gone through, they manage to put the girl in the moon. But that's not a meaningful change. All you can do is either surrender or accept that the system has won. And only by surrendering or accepting can you actually live in it. If you take the only ending in the game, which is actually part of Phantom Liberty, in which you actually survive the relic for all the time you want, because it's taken away, in order to do so, the price the game puts on it is that you no longer can return to the life you had before. You have lost your ability to use your cybernetic implants. 2 years have gone by, and most of your social relations turn your back on you, or they have changed. And all this means that even if you saved yourself biologically, you're alive, your life as such has been sacrificed on the way. You could not save who you were. You only can try to become someone new, another of the faceless faces in the crowd, which is that kind of ending. And all the other endings end with you dying. Sooner or later, one way or another, but you die. You pay the ultimate sacrifice, because that's the only way in which things can go. That's the only way things can end in a cyberpunk setting, when you've actually fought or tried to fight the system. So what we have is that the only people who actually escape the system physically escape the system. They leave it behind. Either the nomads with their clans, either Judy going to their parents, stuff like that. You have to actually physically leave Night City to be able to break with its bonds. But you also have to leave it emotionally. You have to leave the people behind. You have to leave your life behind. You have to leave your identity behind. You have to build someone new elsewhere. Trying to find a community, trying to find something that can actually mean something new. Because all the roads within Night City, all the roads within the cyberpunk world, are closed to this kind of escapism, this kind of happy ending. This is not a world of happy endings. This is a world of death. Most of the time, pointless, useless death. And meaningful change is always beyond our grasp.
We lost everything! We had to pay the price! Yeah, we lost everything! We had to pay the price!
Which brings us to the conclusions of this very long video, which I guess by now you've found out it's going to be a very dark and grim conclusions, because all was pointless. All the sacrifices were for nothing. The best things you could do, maybe get someone you loved out, maybe leave for a time. That's all there is. Of course, there's lots of things we haven't talked about in this video, because there's no time to it, and even if I'm ranting along the different topics, I may not think about those things on the line. Things like people working in clouds losing their complete identities to become dolls to pleasure someone else, or the price BDs have on the identity of people when they merge, as we see in the story of the BD shopping in Phantom Liberty and stuff like that. That leads to another aspects of the things we've been talking about, identity, about technology and stuff like that. Well, I'm sorry if I couldn't cover everything in this video. I guess that's that. I'm just a person ranting on this kind of things. But the key takeaway I want anyone to take away from the game and the series and the Cyberpunk as in general is that it's a warning sign. It's not a depiction of reality. Reality doesn't work that way. Reality could work that way if certain choices were made along the line, and we could end up in a cyberpunkish world. But we're not there yet. There's still places for us to change that storyline, to reach a different conclusion, to change the world in a meaningful way. We don't live in a world of such abject and extreme individualism. Communities are strong. We don't live, as Fukuyama said at the end of history, change is still possible, because collective action is still strong and ideologies are still strong in the real world. And all those things that Cyberpunk was talking about it was talking about as a cautionary tale. It's telling us this is the price if we take certain choices. So make sure we don't take those choices. There's a story, I don't remember who wrote it, I'll put it down on words or something, that goes something along the lines of, there's a new book called Don't Build the Terrible Thingamajiggy. And so, right now, the new Grand Brand Corporation announces that we've fulfilled his vision and built the great terrible Thingamajiggy. The book was a cautionary tale. Don't build the Thingamajiggy. But sometimes corporations, in the search of profit and stuff like that, actually build the Thingamajiggy. Ready Player One is a cautionary tale. Don't go this way. And then we have Facebook going all over the place and trying to build this kind of virtual reality like Ready Player One. And stuff like that is happening all the time. Corporations are not humans. They don't behave like humans. They don't think like humans. They want to be seen as humans because they have brands and they try to portray an identity, work ethics, a set of values, but they don't have them. They only care about profits. And that's reality. That's how they behave. And market share and all those kinds of things. So, there's a cautionary tale in Cyberpunk that we have not listened to enough, which is don't go the neoliberal economical route. Don't give corporations the power they want to have. You have to have counterbalances. You have to have a complex society that actually can manage to control them, to rein them in, into a workable way in which they benefit society. It's not society that benefits corporations. And that requires changing a lot of things in our society, in our daily lives. Things like the role of government in economics. Well, governments play a very strong role in economics and they should play a stronger one with the proper set of values. Things like fighting economic inequality, giving access to people to basic things like healthcare or jobs and stuff like that. And reining the corporations to obey things that are more important than profit. Things like justice, things like communities, things like well-being, human life. The system is meant for those in power to keep the power they have and hopefully for them increase it. That's why we see that the neoliberal system is doing exactly that. It's making the rich richer and the poor poorer, just like Cyberpunk said it would. It did. So the warning was quite accurate, quite touching in the things it was talking about, and quite correct in its diagnosis of the problem. We have to strengthen collective action, we have to strengthen communities, and we have to strengthen values, shared values, that actually put well-being, human life, values like equality and stuff like that on the forefront of policies, both economic and political ones, on the forefront of collective action and stuff like that. When all those things disappear, when we lose the line and we accept that politics is just a matter of interests, of objectives like President Myers does in the games, when we accept that corporations only have to care about profits and share margins and the sharehold values and giving profits to the stakeholders and stuff like that, then we are giving power to this terrible machine that's trying to dehumanize us all. It's trying to lead us into this place where our identities are pointless. I don't think humanity will ever go completely in the cyberpunk path. It's a very extreme path. Like all dystopias, reality never goes so far into any of the extremes. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't touch on a lot of the things that we really are going through, and the real things we are going to go through in the future. Because cybernetic implants are coming, sooner or later, but we're already seeing prosthetics like new arms, hearts that are machine-like for people who need a heart transplant and stuff like that, all over the place. So those things are coming. And what happens when you can buy a heart that's actually better than your original heart? What happens when you can buy an arm that's stronger and cerebral processor to enhance your brain? and stuff like that. That's when we get to the point in which another great cyberpunk game, Deus Ex, talks about this debate about how humans are willing to trade humanity for improvements on physical and mental capacities, and how that changes society, what conflicts will rise from those kinds of things, because they are coming. We're already seeing it with the rise of AI, for example, and how it might threaten certain jobs like writers and voice actors and stuff like that. And AI is here to stay. New tools will be invented to be able to create new things, like, I know, deep fakes that are completely indistinguishable from real videos and stuff like that, which leads to an arms race into things like how we create identities, how we create personalities, how we define ourselves, and how we define others. Because technology is one of the main drives of social change. As what we can do changes, society changes as an answer, and always goes behind it. Social change through technology always happens before new laws, new ethics are dominant, are created. So those things Cyberpunk is talking about are coming. Probably not in such an extreme and exaggerated way as Cyberpunk portrays it, but the topics it's discussing, how we build our identities, the role of the government, the role of economics, the way in which we can change these things, those topics are here to stay and will be as important as ever, if not more, in the years, decades to come. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you found this interesting and, I don't know, thought-provoking or something. And I'll gladly read your comments and all those kinds of things, because I think there's a lot more to be said. Maybe I'll have to do another video later on or something. I don't know. As I said, I just had to take this all out of my chest and pour it somewhere. We'll see where this goes, if it goes somewhere or it doesn't. There's not a plan here. I guess I am a bit punk in the cyberpunk way.